My name is Sarah McNutt. I'm a senior at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa this year, and I'm majoring in French and politics. During my junior year at Cornell, I had the privilege to participate in an experiential learning course in South Africa and Namibia, where my research focused on post-apartheid language policy. But before talking about the research, I want to give you a little background on the structure and goals of the course. As you probably know, Cornell uses the block plan, so we take one course for 3.5 weeks. This study abroad program was a Cornell course, so we were abroad for a month. The group of students and professors who traveled to South Africa and Namibia was composed of 2 courses, and the course I participated in was on education policy. We began our trip in Johannesburg, South Africa, and went on to spend the majority of our time in Windhoek, Namibia, which is the capital, as well as some extremely rural villages in northern Namibia. So, what exactly did the education system in South Africa and Namibia look like under apartheid, and how did the system develop? Why were the 2 countries tied, and where are they in terms of education policy today? These were all questions I wanted to answer when we left. Our coursework in Africa was composed almost entirely of experiential learning in 3 primary forms: visits to rural primary and secondary schools, which took place in northern Namibia, meetings with teachers and government officials, and visits to cultural and historic sites of significance. Before we spent any time in the classrooms, we spent several days visiting landmarks in South Africa, and it's clear that although the system of apartheid has ended, the devastation caused will be a long time in changing. The Apartheid Museum and the Hector Isaacson Museum are both extremely well done and gave us a little more insight into what apartheid South Africa looked like. This is a school we visited in northern Namibia, and from what we saw, a fairly typical environment in a rural town. We learned quickly on this trip that before we could understand how education systems function today in South Africa and Namibia, we needed to have at least a foundational understanding of how these challenges were created. In 1948, the nationalist government came to power in South Africa, and a system of segregation began. The system became known as apartheid and continued until 1994, which you probably know. What's probably less known is that after World War I, the League of Nations mandated Namibia to South Africa, and Namibia remained under the control of South Africa until 1990, which is why you see this connection between a system of apartheid in both countries. Now, during the system of apartheid in South Africa and Namibia, the education system was stratified along racial lines, as was society in general. We learned that 4 racial categories define the education system. The terms used during apartheid were white, Indian or Asian, colored, and black. Schools were segregated accordingly, as was federal funding. Federal funding was funneled almost entirely to white schools, and very little, if any, was given to other school systems. Ultimately, both South Africa and Namibia have struggled to develop a functional education policy. From what we learned on the course, I would be prepared to argue that there are 3 primary contributing factors. First, the political and cultural atmosphere of the countries has been slow to change. Although Afrikaans is still widely spoken in both countries, it's absolutely politically unacceptable as a language of instruction because it's still considered the language of oppressors. In both countries, though, there's been a big push by parents to have English as a language of instruction in classrooms as early as possible because ideally they want their students to be as internationally competitive as possible. Second, a wide variety of tribal languages are still spoken in home environments. However, federal resources simply can't provide for classroom materials in so many languages. In almost every school we saw, the most valuable or conversely most needed possession was a copy machine. And it was also clear that although a teacher may speak a tribal language, it's very unlikely that he or she will speak as many languages as are going to be spoken in that classroom. Another significant problem is the lack of teacher qualifications. The generation of teachers currently teaching is generally not equipped to speak in the language of instruction, English. This creates numerous obvious problems. The generation of teachers teaching in primary and secondary schools in Namibia generally speaks Afrikaans, and at least 1 or 2 tribal languages. And just looking at the time frame when these teachers would have been educated, that makes sense. But this means that English is often a 3rd or 4th language, and one that they have no formal education in. Most of our classroom-based experiential learning took place in northern Namibia, and we learned that the post-apartheid education system, racial stratifications have been extremely hard to overcome. In Namibia, English is now the language of instruction after grade 3, so until that point, students are taught in tribal languages in the classroom, and English is taught as a subject rather than the language of instruction. We heard universally that the transition to English in grade 3 is extremely but unsurprisingly difficult for students. To understand the social landscape of South Africa, you only need to look at the education system. Our class had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Jean Baxton, professor at the Education College at the University of Cape Town, and looking back on our trip, I think these words were pretty insightful. Both South Africa and Namibia continue to struggle with advancement when the education system is in such desperate need of reform. Because both countries are so ethnically diverse, the problem of language policy remains heavily debated and controversial, although both countries have high hopes that the future will bring less political and social upheaval and ultimately a more functional education system.